So welcome everyone to today's webinar, Stepping Up to the Plate, How Canada Can Meet Ambition on Phasing Out Fossil Fuel Support. My name is Julia Levin. I'm an Energy and Climate Program Manager with Environmental Defense. And I'm joining you today from the traditional and unceded land of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. Some people know it as Ottawa. For those of you who, like me, are settlers, I encourage you and all of us to learn more about the history of our land and reflect on our relationship to the land and the Indigenous peoples who have stewarded the land since time immemorial. I also want to thank IISD for convening this webinar. We are very lucky to have such a knowledgeable group of panelists to dig into the issue of how subsidies and support for fossil fuels are undermining climate action in Canada. Before we start, I just want to do a little bit of housekeeping. So as you can see, this webinar is being recorded and it will be made available afterwards. We're going to start with each panelist giving an opening presentation, and then we'll move into a Q&A portion. So as you're listening to the presentation, if questions come up, please do use the Q&A function and put your questions in there. And you can also vote for other people's questions so we can know we have a better read on what you really want to get answered. And we'll get to as many of them as we can. If you're feeling inclined, please do share what you're learning, anything interesting you hear on social media using the hashtag #StopFundingFossils. Okay, so as you might know, this past weekend marked the 5-year anniversary of the Paris Agreement. And so this is an important moment to reflect on where Canada stands in relation to our commitment to doing our fair share to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. As UN Secretary Antonio Guterres often reminds us, when countries give out fossil fuel subsidies, they're using taxpayer dollars to fuel the climate emergency. Eliminating fossil fuel subsidies and support is a critical step to ensure a climate-safe future and transition to a low-carbon economy. And Canada has a long-standing commitment over a decade long to phase out inefficient fossil fuel subsidies by 2025. Despite this commitment and strong public support and pressure for subsidy reform, we really haven't made that much progress, and we continue to give huge amounts of support to the oil and gas sector in this country. So to dig into these issues further, I'll now turn to our panelists who will each give an opening presentation. And we're going to kick things off with Angela Picciariello. Angela is a senior research officer in the Climate and Sustainability Program at the Overseas Development Institute, where her work focuses on opportunities to deliver climate objectives in an equitable way. So a recent scorecard ranked Canada last among G20 OECD countries for progress in ending fossil fuel support. Angela will tell us more about how Canada did and how we compare to other countries. And the floor is yours, Angela.
Thank you, Julia, for the presentation and for having me here. Let me try to share my screen. Can you see it well?
Yep.
So yeah, hi everybody who's online. And the idea for this presentation was to present some of the main findings from the Doubling Back and Doubling Down report that Julia mentioned. This report was published last month by IISD, OCI, and ODI jointly. And the study looks at tracking all G20 countries' progress in ending support to fossil fuel. And we do so by looking at transparency, commitment, and financial support that each government provided to coal, oil and gas, fossil fuel-based power, and fossil fuel consumption. And I was thinking of giving a brief introduction of the main findings for the G20 countries as an aggregate, and then look at how each country compares to the other countries according to our indicators. And then finally, given the scope of the webinar, do a zoom in on Canada and end with that. So let's go to maybe the main finding of the report. What we've seen is that over the last 3 years, so the 2017-2019 period, G20 government as a whole provided $584 billion US dollars in government support to fossil fuels as an average, as an annual average. And if we look at the support mechanisms that they used to do so, as we can see in this graph, we see that a lot of this support was provided through SOE investments. So this is state-owned enterprises, capital expenditures in fossil fuel projects through equity or debt. Part of this was provided through public finance, so loan or guarantees provided by public finance institutions. Some of the support, actually a big chunk, again, was provided through what we call price support. So support to lower the prices for consumption of fossil fuels for consumers below market price. And then we've got what we call tax expenditure. So any form of tax breaks that goes to the fossil fuel industries, and equally direct transfers that goes to these type of industries. What this graph shows is that effectively there has been a decrease in the total support of to fossil fuels between the 2014-2016 period and the 2017-2019 period. So we calculated a 9% drop in the support. But then this is not as good news as it might look like, because 1/3 of this support was due to decline in oil prices. And also the support was not consistent across all G20 countries. So there have been 7 countries out of the G20 that actually increased their support in the last 3 years compared to the previous 3. And Canada is one of these. When you look at how the support was split across fossil fuel type, you see that the big chunk of the support went to oil and gas production, and another big chunk went to the consumption of fossil fuels themselves. And these are aggregate numbers that we've tried to make sense of by producing what we call scorecards. So we try to look at countries and see how they compare with each other in terms of their progress in ending the support for fossil fuels. We look at 7 indicators, which you see here very briefly. We look at transparency, we looked at the pledges and commitments made by countries to phase out fossil fuel support, the scale of government support for coal, oil and gas, fossil fuel-based power, and fossil fuel use, all of them on per unit of GDP. And then we looked at progress in ending government support. This includes also, I will talk about it later a bit, the COVID-19 public money commitments. And it's important to say this was the indicator to which we gave the biggest weight in the scorecard, because we thought it was particularly relevant in this space. We created 2 separate scorecards for the OECD and non-OECD members. And just to give you an idea of how this looks like, this is the OECD members one. So you can see that Germany was the country that scored the best. Mexico, Turkey, and the UK were the worst countries on par. Canada was 5th in the scorecard, but I'll go into more details in a while on this. And this is what the non-OECD members scorecard looks like. So Brazil was the best scoring country. Saudi Arabia was the worst. Just a remark on this. I mean, the scorecards are a useful tool to get a broad idea of how countries are doing. But then none of the countries that we looked at was actually doing well. I mean, even our best performers, like say Brazil, say Germany, were actually pretty mediocre in their performances. And this is important to keep in mind when we judge this from a bigger picture perspective. What I wanted to show, was a zoom in on Canada. So what happened specifically with Canada in the last 3 years? So we've calculated the average total government support provided to fossil fuels in the 2017-2019 period. And these amounted to at least $14.3 billion US dollars. And you can see that a big chunk of that was actually coming from public finance, 11.6 billion per year on average, which means that actually Canada was the country providing the biggest public finance to fossil fuels when you look at per unit of GDP. Scale. This was mostly provided through its export credit agency, the Export Development Canada. The majority of the support went to oil and gas production in terms of fuel type. And in spite of some progress that we've seen over the last few years, for example, with reforming certain tax deductions, starting in 2017, going on until 2022, the total progress for Canada was actually not very positive. We've seen a 12% increase in the total support provided to fossil fuels when you look at the 2017-2019 average relative to the 2014-2016 one. What this table does not include is what has happened during this current year, especially in response to the COVID-19 crisis. And for this, we have relied on data from the Energy Policy Tracker, which some of you might know. The Energy Policy Tracker is an online database that is curated by over 20 research organizations across the world, and it gets updated on a weekly basis. And what we do is basically tracking public money commitments to fossil fuel or clean energy on the other side across a number of energy sectors. So we look at mobility, we look at buildings, power, and resources. And this is what you see at the top of my slide is the picture for the totality of the countries that we are currently tracking, 29 countries. So you see that 53% of the total money committed so far have gone to fossil, against only 36% going to what we classify as clean energy. To the bottom of my slide, you see what happened to Canada, at least what we've been able so far to quantify in terms of energy policies over the last year. $14.5 billion went to what we defined as fossil energy, and only $13.2 billion went to clean energy, with the biggest fossil policy being the $4.4 billion loan guaranteed that the Alberta government provided to the TC Energy's Keystone XL pipeline, and the biggest green policy being part of the Quebec's climate change and economic plan. So I think it was $2.7 billion went to the transport sector, and this we define as clean. Yeah, I think I'll stop there, and happy to take questions and look forward to the discussion afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you, Angela. There was a lot in there. I'm excited to unpack some of that as we go forwards. We will move on to our next speaker, Michael Lazarus. Michael is a senior scientist and director of the Stockholm Environment Institute's US Center. He co-leads the recently published Production Gap Report, which highlights the disconnect between countries' energy plans and climate commitments. Michael will be digging into the report with us and outlining Canada's role in the widening production gap. Over to you, Michael.
Thanks, Julia, and thanks, Angela, as well, for making clear how deep fossil fuel support continues to be. Now I'm here in Seattle, just south of the border, and I was really, truly inspired last Friday with the announcement of Canada's new climate plan. Very ambitious, something that the rest of the world can aspire to match in many ways. You know, a carbon price of up to $170 a ton, a clean fuel standard, investments in innovation, resilience, just transitions. Great stuff. But I was a little disappointed. It talks about making oil and gas production cleaner. You know, oil and gas is essential to the country's emissions. A quarter of the country's emissions come from it. It's understandable, but it said nothing about slowing its growth and only increasing its competitiveness. Now, that's kind of understandable. You know, countries that you know, have brought in lots of revenue from oil and gas production are quite hooked on it, and there are a lot of interests that are tied to it. But the thing is that if all countries that do that build out their infrastructure and at this pace with pipelines and export terminals and so forth, we're locking in a future that makes it very hard to meet our climate targets. There is this basic disconnect that continues to this day between how countries plan for climate and climate action and what they do on the energy front. And so that's why, can you all see my screen?
Yep.
That's why last year we launched the very first production gap report together with IISD, ODI, other partners, and the United Nations Environment Program. And what we did with this report is to look at this discrepancy between countries' planned fossil fuel production and what would be consistent with keeping warming within 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius. So here's a view of the production gap report. And so what we did is we looked at, to quantify this gap, we first estimate the fossil fuel production that would be consistent with limiting global warming to 1.5 or 2 degrees. So there we're looking at the IPCC least cost mitigation scenarios. And here you'll see that the blue line is the median, the green line is the median for 2 degrees, 1.5 and 2 degrees. And then we looked at this red line. We estimated the level of global fossil fuel production being planned by countries worldwide that is embedded in the plans and projections of countries. Sort of like what you have in Canada, and we in fact used it, the Canada Energy Futures report by the Canadian Energy Regulator. In some cases, they're projections, in some cases, they're plans, but in all cases, they are very much used by investors and others to plan investment and to make plans around where communities and companies are going. And so that's really important. And so what you see here is a production gap that is quite gaping. That basically countries are planning on producing about twice as much out in 2030 as would be consistent with 1.5 degrees. The very same climate goals that countries like Canada are aspiring to. So how do we address this production gap? And the other line there is the production, that gold line is the production implied by climate pledges, also inadequate. So then this year, our special focus this year was on naturally on COVID-19 recovery and what that means. And what we found was, of course, you see this black line shows the drop of about 7% in global fossil fuel production that we're expecting this year. And the question is, where do we go from here? It's a potential turning point, right? We could, if countries invest in recovery in such a way that we shift to a green recovery, which studies show creates more jobs, more robust economy, we can start to bring that path down. And this is an indication based on work by the International Energy Agency that we drew into fossil fuel production here. We can start getting closer to 1 to 2 degrees, if not 1.5, with green recovery. Or we can rebound back to the pre-COVID-19 projections. And what we found this year so far, at least at the time that we did the gap analysis this year, is that countries had yet to shift their plans, their projections. And as Angela pointed out, the work of the Energy Policy Tracker has shown that countries are investing far more in fossil fuels still than in clean energy in their recovery packages. Now, we're hoping to see that change, because we're at this juncture where we have this really important opportunity to move away from returning to that blue line and that discrepancy and really building back better with more resilient economies, less dependent on fossil fuel production. Now, one thing we look at in the production gap report is we look across countries. And this year we had a special focus on just transitions and what that might look like in different countries of the world. So we looked at countries based on research that has been done about equity and transitions, really drew it out along these 2 axes. So the ability to transition away from fossil fuels at the pace we need. I'm going to go back up for a second and just point one thing out. That if you look here, you'll see that the decline you need to take to get on 1.5 is quite steep. And it's about 6% per year on average, reduction in fossil fuel production. And that translates to 11% in coal. We have to basically get to a quarter of our current coal production by 2030. And slightly less steep, but still steep for oil and gas, 4% for oil and 3% for gas. So So think about those, we need to reduce at that kind of pace to meet those climate targets. So what does that mean across countries? Countries that are highly dependent on fossil fuel revenue that accounts for half or more of their government activities, countries like Ecuador and Nigeria and Angola, very hard for them to transition rapidly. They also have fewer resources. So that's why we really need to look to the wealthier countries that have more diversified economies to move more quickly. Thus, the most rapid wind down, faster than those averages, needs to happen in countries like the US, like Canada. It's a high bar, but it's absolutely essential if we put justice and equity right at the front of our transitions. Okay, so let's turn to Canada for a second. And I just want to close out by just pointing out some interesting points about this Canada's Energy Futures Report that was released 3 weeks ago. It was released after we had finished work on the production gap report this year, so we didn't include it in this year's report. It will feature in next year's report. What's really interesting here is that for years, the Energy Futures Report has focused on sort of a reference scenario, business as usual, not much climate action. The world is changing, and this is a chart directly from the report, and it shows that now, if you look at the top of this orange line, that is oil production rising from about, from its current dip up to 5 million barrels per day across Canada, growing out to 2039 before declining to about 5.5 million barrels per day. And so what's going on here is that there's a reckoning, this has become the primary scenario now, a reckoning that oil demand isn't going to be what we thought it was going to be, and there's going to be more climate action. But still, growth out to 2039. So what if we look at what other studies say about Canadian oil? And this is quite interesting, or just what we need to do. And so here, mapped on here, is sort of the scaled projections from international agencies' World Energy Outlook 2020. And this top sort of brownish line shows that in their stated policy scenario, which is basically last year's pledges and so forth, climate pledges, flat production in Canada, no growth of any significance there. That shows that others look at the situation and see even under sort of current conditions, there's no reason to expect Canada to grow its market share. Then if we look at this red dotted line, we look at, this is North America in their sustainable development scenario. It's about a 1.8 degree scenario. Well, we see that a need for decline, and they're using cost curves to assess who should decline fastest. And then let's look also at what it means to decrease at that 6% per year, or 4% per year that we talked about, that IPCC scenarios say that oil needs to decline to meet that 1.5 target. And look, it's way lower than this. And so there's this discrepancy here between climate aspirations, even just what a competitive market should suggest is going to happen. So that creates risks. That creates risks not just for the climate, but that creates risks for Canada itself. Now, 6 months ago, we did a study at SEI, led by my colleague Pete Erickson, where we looked at the risks of new oil and gas production for Canada. And there are some important sort of takeaways there as well. I think the climate plan is called Healthy Economy, Healthy Environment, which is great to link the two. But the problem is that it's not just a risk for the environment to continue along this path, it's a risk for the economy. Canada is not the world's cheapest producer. So the competitive forces out there mean that we may not need growth. We may not need those pipelines that are in order, if even under the evolved scenario. So there are real risks of stranding assets and stranding communities. And let me just leave it there. And I'm glad to answer more questions about this. Thing is, we haven't seen enough change in the past year yet, that countries have really started to align their energy plans with their climate plans. And that's what we need to see happen in Canada and elsewhere. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Michael. I'm glad to hear you mention that the CER report, even with its really unambitious evolving scenario, shows that there's no need for additional pipeline capacity, specifically the TMX expansion in KXL. I also really appreciate the equity lens on this year's production gap report. I think it's often missing from the conversation in Canada that we have not just the capacity, but also the responsibility to be a leader when it comes to an equitable wind down from fossil fuels, given our wealth, clean sector expertise, and the relatively low percentage of our GDP that comes from oil and gas. I do also want to encourage everyone to drop your questions in the Q&A function, please. The more we hear from you, the more we can make sure that we're getting to the points you really want to dig into. Yeah, so just an invitation to go ahead and do that at any moment. Our third speaker is Vanessa Corkal. Vanessa is a policy analyst with the Energy Program at the International Institute for Sustainable Development. Her work focuses on climate change and energy policy, including green recovery, fossil fuel subsidies, a just transition, and sustainable food systems. Here in Canada, we often hear from the oil and gas industry that they aren't receiving any subsidies. Vanessa's gonna give us a bit of a reality check on some of these misconceptions. Take it away, Vanessa.
Thanks so much, Julia, and thanks to all of you who have tuned in. I'm really glad we have such a large audience for this really important topic. So what I'm going to do in my presentation, and admittedly get a little bit into the more technical aspects and try to make those technical issues a little easier to understand, so that all of us on the call can be better equipped to push and encourage our governments, whether we are working outside of government or whether we're working inside, to step up to the plate and stop avoiding the thorny issue of phasing out harmful fossil fuel subsidies. So I'm just going to share my screen here. If I can figure out how to share it. Slideshow. There we go. Were you showing? Is it visible? Yeah, okay, yes. Perfect. Okay, thanks. Yeah, so I just want to step back a little bit because, you know, Angela did a great overview of our levels of fossil fuel support in Canada, but I know there's a lot of confusion in the general public, in media, on what the term subsidies versus the term support is. So I want you to conceptualize two concentric circles as I've put on this slide. When we talk about support, we're talking about a term that includes subsidies, but is not just subsidies. So just like all basset hounds are dogs, but not all dogs are basset hounds, all subsidies are support, but not all support are subsidies. So when we're talking about subsidies, we're mainly talking about direct spending and tax breaks. Subsidies has an agreed upon definition internationally under the World Trade Organization, and there are well-established international methodologies on how to measure them. When we're talking about support, this is a broader term that includes subsidies, but as Angela discussed, it also includes higher levels of public finance, state-owned enterprises, and other supports. You might also hear about the term externalities. So these are the costs of climate change, the costs associated with health impacts from pollution. These are also very costly. And while IISD doesn't refer to these as subsidies under the technical definition, these costs are also important to consider when we're talking about justifying providing support to fossil fuels. So I think it's also important to think about what has Canada officially agreed to? And as Julia mentioned in her opening statements, we've agreed to phase out inefficient fossil fuel subsidies by 2025. This is a commitment that dates back to 2009. That's a long time ago. A lot has happened since then. We have a lot more understanding globally of where we need to go as a global community. So it's worth posing the question on what does the world actually need? And here I would pose the question of whether or not we need to go further than this in our commitments as a country. Antonio Guterres' State of the Planet speech a couple weeks ago talked about the suicidal war we're waging on nature. He specifically called out phasing out subsidies and public finance. So this is something we're working to push here in Canada. So in my presentation today, I'm going to talk specifically about subsidies. So that smaller circle that has a very clear international definition. And we just published this brief. For those of you that really like nerding out on technical issues, you can check it out on our website that just got published. The URL is at the bottom of the screen. Basically, we're calling for increased transparency from federal and provincial governments and encouraging Canadian governments to follow international best practices. There's a well-established practice for accounting for subsidies. That's the same methodology that we follow and that the United Nations Environment Program has suggested to follow, and that we need to quantify subsidies in order to evaluate them. And unfortunately, there has been misinformation spread by industry and some provinces that undermine some of the international research and methodologies. So we're going to bust some of those myths today. So the first myth you may have heard is that there's many different definitions of subsidies out there and there isn't an agreed upon definition. I think there's even some confusion about that within governments in Canada. Yes, last week I was on a webinar with Minister Jonathan Wilkinson, the Minister of Environment and Climate Change, who mentioned that you talk to 10 people and you're going to get 10 different definitions. That's true, people do use the word in different ways, but the World Trade Organization is internationally agreed upon by many countries, including Canada, and there is a well-established way to measure these subsidies that specifically for the Sustainable Development Goal indicator as well, 12.C.1, and that Sustainable Development Goal is responsible consumption of production. So there is a well-established way to do this, and when Canada is doing its peer review, we've asked Canada to adhere to international definitions when they're doing that. We've also heard from industry as well, and that this is also common arguments in the media, that Canada's oil and natural gas industry is not subsidized, and that subsidy means an unfair advantage or benefits. Or you might hear that tax breaks and royalty relief are not subsidies. The reality is that the industry does receive a number of subsidies in Canada from provincial and federal governments under the WTO definition, and that tax breaks and royalty relief do fall under the WTO definition as what we call foregone revenue. We've also heard some claims like subsidies to the oil and gas sector aren't too important to deal with because they pale in comparison to subsidies to other sectors like urban transit or the film industry. Whereas we would pose the question, obviously public transit has significant social and environmental benefits. More movie production means more movies, more fossil fuel production means increased pollution and increased climate change. Another common myth that money that reduces greenhouse gas emissions or creates environmental benefits is not a subsidy, or that these subsidies are not inefficient, that they are efficient, so we don't need to tackle them. The reality is that this money, even though it has some benefits, still lowers the cost of business for fossil fuel producers, and it is technically still a subsidy. So we would like more transparency from governments on these types of subsidies. And when we're figuring out which subsidies are transparent, we need to have robust criteria to figure out if something is efficient or not. And we also need a plan to transition away from these subsidies over time. So when we talk about efficiency, we really should be looking at social, environmental, and economic costs. And subsidies that have environmental benefits, so for example, the orphan wells money provided this year that was really important both for jobs as well as for environmental cleanups, may still be inefficient. For example, if they are expensive and they're creating opportunity costs, if they're creating dangerous precedents where government's going to have to pay for things in the future, and we could be better achieving things through regulations. We've also seen some subsidies encouraging industry to switch to natural gas when it might be better to switch straight to renewables. So these things all need to be considered, and we have to create plans to transition away from these over time. And a couple other common myths: we can't phase out subsidies since we need them for affordable household energy. The reality is that these are a very small portion of existing subsidies in Canada, and the vast majority of subsidies at the provincial and federal level are for producers. And lastly, that removing subsidies means that you're advocating for job losses and energy insecurity. Reality is that subsidy reform can help us transition to clean energy by removing market distortions. It can help us create jobs. It can also enhance energy security. For example, by phasing out subsidies for diesel and phasing in options for clean energy over time while still maintaining affordability. So I just wanted to present the latest research once we, that document that we just published that outlines some of these technical issues. We also did a tally of where we are right now. The current tally is around $4.8 billion of fossil fuel subsidies across provinces and the federal government. The vast majority of those are happening at the provincial level, but there's still a significant amount of money that's happening at the federal level as well. So this gives you a sense of the most egregious regions. And specifically, we wanted to look at tax subsidies because this is something where we really don't have a lot of transparency in Canada. And to give you a sense of the numbers, we found 128 different tax subsidy policies for fossil fuels in Canada. So when you look at all of the subsidies in Canada, tax subsidies represent 67%, so 2/3 of subsidies in Canada, and represent at least $3.2 billion per year. The problem is that we can only actually quantify half of them because half of that 128 we don't have any data on. That includes both federal and provincial subsidies. So some of the most common ones at the provincial level are royalty rebates for oil and gas producers, carbon pricing exemptions, mining tax exemptions, and exemptions on fuel taxes for aviation, agriculture, rail, and more. So where we're at right now is that we had a nice surprise in this year's, for those of us that like to nerd out about these things, this year's federal tax documents had much better transparency on the measures of fossil fuel subsidies that provide specific tax breaks to the sector, but there's still very little data on how much they are, and not all measures were included. Federally, we're also trying to push along the G20 peer review with Argentina. We know this is well behind schedule, maybe partially due to COVID, but nonetheless, we're nearing, we're past the 2-year mark, I think, or Julia can confirm. But most other countries that have done this review have been in the 12 to 18 month length. And we're also seeing a renewed commitment to achieve that G20 commitment in the climate plan that was released last Friday. So I wanted to highlight a little bit on what's happening in the climate plan. There's a very exciting move to increase the carbon price, which I think sends a really important signal to the private sector. But at the same time, support and subsidies to fossil fuels are like a leaky boat. If you have one while having the other, the carbon price isn't going to be that effective. So we need to do both of these things at the same time. And we also need funding for just transition to be able to transition affected communities. And the other thing is that we saw some interesting announcements in the new climate plan for the Net Zero Accelerator Fund, which is supposed to be to expedite decarbonization projects with large emitters, and the 1.5 billion low carbon and zero emissions fuel fund, which is supposed to increase the production and use of low carbon fuels, which include hydrogen, renewable natural gas, and more. So we're still waiting for details on these, because if these are not applied properly, they could represent significant subsidies to the oil and gas industry, and also create an opportunity cost. For example, if we spend a lot of energy rolling out fossil-based hydrogen, as the rest of the world is moving to renewable hydrogen. So we really want to think about whether we are using these funds the best way possible to get us where we need to go. And that leads us to my last slide, which is about green strings. As we are coming out of this pandemic and figuring out the best way to move our economy towards a low carbon economy, we need to be applying strict conditions to ensure that we're spending our money effectively in a way that aligns with climate change. This is a report released earlier this summer that Environmental Defense also signed on to. There's 7 principles in it. And the first principle is to ensure that companies create net zero plans, being a strict condition of receiving assistance. And also that money should be prioritized for jobs, not executives and shareholders. Some of you may have seen the news last week where the Financial Post and CBC looked into where the wage subsidy has been spent in Canada and found out that a significant amount of companies were still paying dividends to shareholders, including oil and gas companies. So we need to enforce these conditions, and overall we need transparency on where our money is going so we can have a proper debate and move towards sustainable energy systems, generating savings and putting us on a path to a just and resilient future. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Vanessa. That was so helpful. I know I constantly hear a lot of those myths, and it can be incredibly frustrating, especially as the government, like you said, is preparing even more subsidies for fossil hydrogen and carbon capture storage. Those are things that we will continue to be tracking for, as Vanessa laid out. And yes, we are at the 30-month mark for the peer review, so just way behind schedule. Fortunately, that seems to show that the government isn't taking this commitment very seriously, despite a lot of public pressure to do so. We will continue to hold their feet to the fire on this. So our last presentation is from Alex Doukas. Alex is the Stop Funding Fossils Program Director at Oil Change International. His work focuses on ending international subsidies and public finance for fossil fuels. I think it's safe to say that the new US administration under President-elect Biden is expected to usher in a new era of federal climate policy in the United States. Alex will help us understand what can be expected under the new Biden administration and how it could affect Canada. Over to you, Alex.
Great, thanks so much. I really appreciate it. And thanks to everybody for joining us today. So I'm Alex Doukas in Washington, DC with Oil Change International. As Julia said, I'm going to just share my screen now. So give me 1 second while I get that set up. And let's see if that works. Is that doing the trick?
Yes, it is.
Perfect. Okay. So yeah, I'm going to speak a little bit about what we can expect, what we might expect out of the Biden administration and how that might intersect with Canada's performance and policies on climate and energy related to the 3 presentations that have preceded this one. This first slide here that I have is just basically restating what Michael presented in the production gap report in an aggregate way, rather than in a looking at it over time. But just to give you a sense, kind of to reiterate this point on why does fossil fuel supply matter? Why does thinking about how we reduce investment and support for fossil fuels, especially fossil fuel production, why is that important and why is that a priority? And in this case, you can see from this graph, which is from an analysis that we produced earlier this year, looking at the climate commitments of oil companies, which are woefully insufficient, as a little aside. But emissions from developed fossil fuel reserves, so those are reserves that are already developed, they already are producing or have steel in the ground and are under development, compared to Paris-aligned carbon budgets. So the 1.5 degree carbon budget is a 50% chance of limiting warming to below 1.5 degrees, and then the 2 degree budget is a 66% chance of limiting warming to below 2 degrees. And what you can see from this is that developed reserves of fossil fuels, if we were to dig up and burn them all, so this is not all known reserves, but only those reserves that have been developed, would exceed a 2 degree carbon budget. And even if we stopped burning coal tomorrow, if we said no more coal, we're done, we're going to stop mining and burning coal tomorrow, oil and gas would still greatly exceed, their developed reserves would greatly exceed a 50% chance of limiting warming to below 1.5 degrees. And those, of course, are the long-term objectives of the Paris Agreement, as limiting warming to below, well below 2 degrees as sort of the hard target, and striving to limit warming to below 1.5 degrees. So just to set a little bit of the context there. So to speak a little bit about the commitments on finance from the Biden campaign platform, so focusing on government support, I want to look at the commitment specific to finance and government support for energy and for climate finance. And what I've done here in this slide is just taken some snippets from the Biden campaign's platform during the primary election. This was the position of the Biden campaign. And on public finance for fossil fuels, the campaign said that Biden would seek a G20 commitment to end all export finance subsidies of high carbon projects, and also had a separate line on no financing for dirty energy. So Biden would ensure that the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, which is the US Development Finance institution, as well as the US Export-Import Bank, which is the sort of peer institution to Canada's Export Development Canada, an export credit agency, as well as the new U.S. International Development Finance Corporation, would significantly reduce the carbon footprints of their portfolios. And I'm going to skip to the next slide here just to touch on why that's significant. So as Angela already mentioned, Export Development Canada's support for fossil fuels, for oil and gas in particular, is tremendous, and is easily the worst in the world, even in absolute terms, even when compared to really big international public finance heavyweights like Japan and China. So you can see here the annual average between 2016 and 2018 of Canada's export finance for oil and gas was closing in on $11 billion US. So you think about the size of China, of China's economy, of China's sort of export finance and international finance efforts, and you think that Canada's look enormous even compared to China's, and that's pretty staggering. That's quite shocking. And I think this is an especially important, just to go back to the commitments here, this is an especially important statistic in light of the Biden commitments here as well. These are pretty specific commitments, mind you. You know, these are kind of getting into the weeds on what the Biden administration plans to do, and it's something that they're kind of, you know, comfortable with, given that under the Obama administration, the U.S. was very deeply involved in ending international finance for coal. Now they're talking about moving on to high carbon projects, period, not only coal. And as if to underscore this, before the Biden administration is inaugurated in January, you can see, last week, the UK made a sweeping commitment, Boris Johnson made a sweeping commitment to end the UK's overseas finance for fossil fuels, their development finance, their export finance, their trade promotion, pretty much everything. And there's still a couple of, you know, I's to be dotted and T's to be crossed in terms of the details and the timeline for implementation in a consultation that they're running next year. The government's running a consultation through February, but the nature of the commitment is such, and our understanding with speaking to people within government is such that it's going to be fairly categorical. With, if there are any exemptions, they'll be pretty narrow. And UK export finance, just to go back to this slide again, sort of keep tabbing back and forth, but you know, it looks small in relative terms compared to some of the other providers of export finance for fossil fuels. But this is, you know, it's actually quite substantial, their export credits for oil and gas. And so for them to say, actually, we're just going to get out of altogether is pretty consequential. And I think, you know, they have skin in the game on this. So it's something where I think this will motivate the Biden administration to potentially go further, faster on this agenda, having a kind of international partner in crime. And I think Canada could come in for some pressure and criticism from the US as peers on this agenda. Moving on to fossil fuel subsidies. So you just heard a little bit about Canada's failure to deliver on the peer review process under the G20 on fossil fuel subsidies. And as Angela mentioned, you know, they haven't done enough to reform and phase out fossil fuel subsidies either. And the Biden campaign platform says that they will demand a worldwide ban on fossil fuel subsidies. So not exactly mincing words here, not really tiptoeing around it. There's simply no excuse for subsidizing fossil fuels in the US or around the world. And then they go on to say, by engaging key leaders, including China, Biden will secure a global commitment to eliminate fossil fuel subsidies by the end of his first term and will lead by example. There are limits to what the US can do in terms of leading by example without the legislature. There's a question, of course, as the Senate is hanging in the balance at the moment. So they won't be able to do as much to tax expenditures without both houses of Congress in the US. So it remains to be seen whether Democrats will hold the Senate and the House. But even in the absence of that, there are many things that the Biden administration could do with executive action to eliminate certain kinds of subsidies for fossil fuels and for oil and gas in particular. And so, you know, if this is a serious commitment, and it's one that the Biden campaign has reiterated again and again, it may put a lot of pressure on Canada to act, because the US and China were actually the first G20 governments to do a peer review and publish the peer review of their fossil fuel subsidies now years ago under the Obama administration. And Canada's still lagging on their commitment years later to even publish the review. And then finally, I just want to touch on this. It's not about fossil fuel subsidies and support for government support for fossil fuels in particular, but just to note that Biden has also said that they'll recommit the United States to the Green Climate Fund. And I just would contrast that to what Canada's done, which is pledging 300 million Canadian to the replenishment of the Green Climate Fund last year, which is not an increase on their 2014 pledge, and actually a drop in real terms after inflation and exchange rate fluctuations. And that's, you know, that's something that's, I think, a point that doesn't get focused on enough in many circumstances, is Canada's lack of support for proper multilateral climate finance. So just wanted to also lift that up while we're talking about this. And I think one final note on the international context for next year, you know, the Biden administration has said they'll convene a summit on climate action within the first 100 days of the administration. The UK is hosting COP26, the UN climate negotiations at the end of the year next year in Glasgow. And that is the fact that they've come out swinging with this big headline commitment on their overseas public finance, I think is significant in light of that. They're also the host of the G7, and Italy is hosting the G20. So in contrast to the G7 and G20 this year, which was a pretty dysfunctional space with Saudi Arabia hosting the G20 and the US holding the G7 presidency and it being canceled because of the pandemic, I can expect that there will be sort of re-engagement on the multilateral sphere on this, and the US may bring a fair bit of pressure to bear. So just a little bit on that international context, I think we can anticipate potentially ramped up international support for action on these agendas where Canada's falling behind. And my hope is that, the Canadian government, the federal government sees this coming and actually steps up to the plate and has a plan to get ahead of this instead of having to be dragged along kicking and screaming. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Alex. Unfortunately, often we do need to be kicked along, dragging and screaming, but hopefully Canada will do better this time. There is reason to hope. And thanks for highlighting the fact that Canada's really falling short on its commitments under its international climate finance commitments. So I'm seeing some really great questions rolling in. Encourage folks to keep dropping those questions in there. But let's start with the first one. A few of you were asking about the methodology for the energy policy tracker, specifically what is meant by clean versus fossil. Angela, do you want to take a shot at answering that one?
Yes, sure. Thanks, Julia. And apologies for not mentioning the methodology in more details. I was just trying to rush through the presentation. But yeah, the idea was that we classify policies into 3 big buckets, let's say, fossil, clean, and other. And then we have 2 sub-buckets for the fossil and the clean. So we classify, well, it's quite obvious for fossil, anything that has to do with fossil fuels goes into the fossil and is unconditional when there is no environmental conditionality attached to it, while it goes into the fossil conditional bucket when there is some forms of green strings or conditionality. And then we have the clean bucket, which again is split into clean, unconditional, and conditional. So we have clean unconditional is anything that has to do with, renewable energies, energy efficiency for buildings or active transport. So it's like walking or cycling lanes. And then we have the clean conditional, which includes, for example, public transport, so rails, buses. We have finally the other bucket, and I think there was a question about that. That includes nuclear, as someone said, but it also includes, anything that does not go into the other bucket. So, for example, if we have a recovery package, which is quite complex, includes different type of energies, and we cannot really split one from the other, we put it into the energy bucket, the other energy bucket. And yeah, I think that's all. Just to say, we also only include approved policies. It's also something that I didn't mention. So we don't include anything that is still in proposal stage. And we include anything that has been approved since 1st of January 2020. So that's the cutoff date for us. And there is more detail about the methodology on the Energy Policy Tracker website if anybody's interested in that.
Thank you for that. Thanks for providing more clarity there, Angela. Vanessa, a question for you. On comments that Minister Wilkinson has made that investments that the government will make alongside oil and gas to reduce their emissions, for example, through direct transfers for carbon capture and sequestration, are not fossil fuel subsidies. Do you wanna respond to that, Vanessa?
Yeah, certainly. And I will acknowledge that we know that there is some disagreement between our approach and what the federal government has indicated they use when they're talking about subsidies. IISD sticks to the WTO definition, and those would be considered subsidies under the WTO definition. But beyond having a technical debate about what to call something, the bigger question is whether or not these types of spending amounts are a good use of public money. And to that, I would look back to what I mentioned in my presentation, which is are these the most efficient policies from social and in economic and environmental perspectives? Just because something has an environmental benefit doesn't necessarily mean it's a good policy. We've seen some pretty significant spending on carbon capture in the past that hasn't resulted in a lot of emissions gains, and it's a really costly technology. And with government's limited money, especially coming out of a pandemic where we've seen unprecedented spending, we really need to make sure that we're getting the best bang for our buck when we're talking about where we're going to spend money on climate change policies. And then I guess from a personal perspective, there's also the question of historical responsibility. And we know that many fossil fuel companies have been well aware of climate change and of the need to transition for many years. And so I have the question of whether or not it's really a smart idea to be providing significant amounts of money to a sector that has traditionally had a lot of clout and a lot of ability to actually make that transition, but has delayed that transition, rather than providing funding to other types of clean energy that we rapidly need to be scaling up.
Thanks for that, Vanessa. We had another question, and this can be for anyone. There's a question about how carbon intensive the tar sands are and how that compares to other producers. I don't know if anyone wants to take a first stab at answering that, and then other people can build on.
Sure. I can speak in general terms. I don't have the latest data, but I will send a link to the Carnegie Oil Climate Index, which is a great resource for comparing different resources in terms of their carbon intensity. In general, oil sands are about the most carbon intensive, GHG intensive source of oil around. There are other heavy oils in Venezuela and elsewhere that compete for that title. There have been some investments in technologies to improve, especially sort of I believe in the in situ, but in general, it still ranks high up there in the carbon indices. Now, we're talking adding, on average, maybe 15 to 20% to the emissions that you would get out of a tailpipe, whereas some other oils are far less carbon intensive. It's interesting. The Saudis have made this push that, well, our oil is clean. So we should produce the last barrel. I think that's a little bit of a stretch, because still we're only talking a 10% on difference on top of the use and production of oil, the use of oil itself. So I think it's easy to get distracted into focusing too much on that 5 or 10 or 15% rather than the 100% from combusting fossil fuels. That said, there's a lot of room and need to reduce emissions, obviously in methane, which we're seeing a lot of investment on talk on. I just want to caution that there oftentimes is lots of expectation. We hear from the industry and others that they will get methane emissions under control. We have heard this for 10 or 15 years or longer. Hopefully, finally that will happen, but the idea that all of a sudden we'll be producing clean oil or gas is a bit of a delusion, I'd say.
Thanks, Michael. Did anyone else want to jump in?
Yeah, maybe just to quickly add on to that. Thanks, Julia, and thanks, Michael. I think the Oil Climate Index is a good resource for this. I'm not sure because I don't have the methodology up in front of me. But one thing just to note, Michael's point is a really important one, which is what are the actual emissions associated with the total, the sort of wells to wheels of the fossil fuel, not just what's the upstream emissions associated with producing it and extracting it in the first place, but what are we enabling in terms of the soil to get burned. But in terms of that upstream chunk of emissions where Canada's tar sands are particularly carbon intensive, I don't think that the Oil Climate Index includes this yet, but there's recent findings that methane emissions are actually considerably higher than previously thought, particularly in Alberta and Saskatchewan. So if that finding holds, I imagine it would further increase the carbon intensity of the Canadian crudes relative to others, of the Canadian unconventional crudes, I should say, relative to others in the oil climate index. Thanks.
Thanks for those answers. I mean, we are constantly hearing in Canada that our oil and gas is cleaner than anywhere else's. So it's really important to have some good myth busting because that's just not the case. We have a great question from an Ontario teacher who's working to pressure the Ontario Teachers Pension Plan to make better investments. This person is asking, what would we recommend the fund invest to be part of climate solutions? Vanessa, did you want to jump in here?
Sure. And I just want to acknowledge that the debate and discussion around how we move private investments to cleaner investments is a really, really big one. And I think we probably need a whole webinar to get into that issue to really do it justice. But first off, I think it's really great to hear that this work is being done to improve the investments that the Ontario Teachers Pension Plan is making. And I think the tack you're taking to sign an open letter and write the fund managers directly is a great one. In terms of where to invest, it might be helpful to look to the Green Strings report that I mentioned that I did earlier. So the Green Strings report was really focused to provide advice to governments, but a lot of those pieces of advice would also apply to fund managers and to financial institutions. And that includes identifying like what are some of the conditions and what are some of the sectors that we want to be focusing our energy in, whether it would be clean energy production, it might be retrofit programs or companies. There could be a number of different types and it really will depend, but we're looking to shift our financial systems to ones that where we're minimizing our climate risk and actually understanding the climate risk of our investments. So that's something that you can sell to fund managers as well, because you want to be moving towards investments that are lower risk, but also are moving us towards cleaner investments. So I know that's a vague answer. There's lots of different sectors, but hopefully that can provide some guidance. And it's great to see that conversation happening.
That was great, Vanessa. If no one else is going to jump in, then we can move to another question. We had a question about with the public is hearing this information, but what can our listeners, as members of the public, do on their own to help bring about action on fossil fuel subsidy reform in Canada, other than voting once every 4 years? Would anyone like to take a stab? I can go first as well.
Go for it, Julia.
Sounds good. So there's a lot that you as a listener can do on this issue. I mean, a few of our organizations, IISD, OCI, Environmental Defense, we work in Canada on these issues. So you can definitely follow our organizations to get the latest information. There's a lot of misinformation, and Vanessa did a great job of myth busting some of that misinformation. So one of the roles of our orgs is to help fight that through providing information. But I encourage you to get in touch with your MPs, because this isn't just a federal issue, also your MPPs or MLAs. Write letters, talk to your friends, write opinion pieces, letters to the editor. We need to raise the political spotlight on this issue. It was there a year ago. It was a big issue during the elections. We got all of the parties basically to make commitments to eliminate fossil fuel subsidies, but it's dropped off the radar in the last year, and we all collectively really need to hold governments accountable to this promise. So there's really so many ways you can get involved. I mean, our organization has a petition as a starting place, but there's no shortage of ways. Does anyone else want to add something to that, or?
I'll add one note, Julia, which is that I mentioned in my presentation that many subsidies are happening at the provincial level. So I just wanted to say that when you're getting in touch with your elected officials, which you should definitely be doing, it's not only important to get in touch with your federal MPs, but also your provincial legislative representatives. And we saw some inspiring movement in the recent BC election, where a number of organizations worked really hard to campaign and ask the parties to stop fossil subsidies in British Columbia, and the BC NDP, the leading party there, promised to review the oil and gas royalty framework. And this is a really small win, and there's going to be a lot of other work to do to make sure that that review happens, and that can be the start of a larger subsidy process. But we have a long way to go to tackle subsidies at the provincial level, and we're really just getting started. So the more we can do to raise awareness at the provincial level, whether that's through social media, through volunteering with organizations that are working provincially, meeting with MLAs, writing op-eds, those things are all really helpful as well, in addition to the federal conversation. And if you're looking for a resource to use, I will put in the chat IISD's frequently asked questions webpage about subsidies. We just updated it. It has information on a few provinces, and a lot of the information I went through in my presentation is there, and it's easy to understand, and you can use that as a resource when you're talking and trying to do advocacy.
Alex, did you want to jump in too?
Yeah, just quickly. I mean, a quick plug if we do some sort of email actions and campaigning around Canadian support for fossil fuels at Oil Change International. I'm Canadian, by the way, so people can call me a foreign funded radical if they need to, but at least I'm one of you all. So, but you can sign up for our email list at priceofoil.org. The other thing I would say, other than supporting all of the groups that are on this call and working on this in Canada, I think there's also an opportunity to organize locally, and it's harder during the pandemic, obviously, but there's still things that people can do with climate justice oriented groups, a lot of them youth-led. Like I know Climate Justice Toronto, Climate Justice Edmonton. I think there are youth-led movements and groups across the country that are pushing for change in kind of a movement-based grassroots way, doing really important work. So if there are ways you can plug in locally with organizing, other than the political action that's sort of direct that's already been talked about, in terms of calling your MP, calling ministers, and making your voice heard that way, I think it's a great way to do creative and different things that can kind of change the conversation on climate in Canada over time. And I think there's a lot of power in building those movements, as we're seeing in the US with the resurgence of a lot of youth climate action through, for example, the Sunrise movement here. But yeah, I think a lot of great work can be done through grassroots movements and more creative action toward climate change.
Thank you for that, Alex. That's a very important reminder. And another way, I'm seeing a question about CPP, Canadian Pension Plan. Folks can definitely put pressure on their own pension plans and their own funds that they contribute to shift what they're investing in and to push for divestment. We have some orgs in Canada working on that. Shift Action is one, but I think we're going to see a lot more around pension funds, especially following the really exciting announcement last week about New York's pension fund divesting from oil and gas. I see another interesting question about if anyone's broken down the subsidy money per oil and gas employee. Like the person asking the question, I mean, we've seen a 50,000 decrease in people working in the sector as production has increased and as subsidies have increased and as royalties have decreased. So I think it's safe to assume, as the person asking the question does, that in terms of subsidy money per oil and gas employee, it's getting higher and higher, aka more subsidy money for less employees. Not sure if any of the other panelists want to jump in there.
I can jump in at a very high level. So when we're talking about the money going towards jobs, certain subsidies are better than others, right? Subsidies that are explicitly for orphan wells reclamation, for example, is going specifically to create jobs. Still subsidy, but there's some clear employment benefits. Some other subsidies might not necessarily have those specific benefits. And a good example is federally, we recently saw $320 million provided from the federal government to the Newfoundland offshore oil industry with essentially no strings attached. I mean, the government said it was supposed to be for jobs, but there's really nothing specific that we've identified to make sure that money is actually going to jobs. And if you were to do the math to figure out the value of that versus the jobs created, my guess is that the value of the job created would be a lot of money. But I also wanted to clarify that this isn't an issue that's really specific to the fossil fuel sector either, that we see this very commonly. Governments make or justify making large investments in industry by justifying the number of jobs created, when often the reality is that the cost of those jobs is quite high, and that the economic money is often flowing outside of that community, and the community doesn't necessarily benefit. So I think a question moving forward from this is, how can we make sure that our investments are supporting local economic development, that communities have a say in what kind of industries are happening in their backyards, and making sure that communities can benefit economically from those activities, but also make sure that those investments make sense and that they're creating good quality jobs that are well paid, that are following labor standards, and creating opportunities for pension, health benefits, and that sort of thing. So it's a complicated issue. It's not just how many jobs, it's also what type of jobs. And I think we have a lot of work ahead recovering from COVID to make sure that not only jobs in the energy sector, but in the caring economy are also good quality jobs.
Thank you, Vanessa. Alex, a question for you. Would there be legal options in Canada to force the government to end fossil fuel support as a consequence of the government being subject to duties to protect citizens against climate change and to protect human rights?
Yeah, thanks for this question, Beert. And I think anybody else should feel free to answer this too. To be clear, I'm not a lawyer, so take what I say here with a grain of salt. I think, unfortunately, in the Canadian case, it seems like it'll be more difficult to get a huge sweeping legal victory on climate action, broadly speaking, in the same vein as like the Urgenda case in the Netherlands, which I know you're familiar with, Beert. Because there was a federal court case that was dismissed, I think just in November, where 15 young Canadians brought a case against the federal government for sort of violating rights related to a lack of climate action, and that case was ultimately thrown out. Not because of the merits of the case, but basically my understanding as a layperson is that there was a determination by the courts that the issues that were being brought, and the constitutional questions being raised were sort of fundamentally political questions that should be left to the legislature and government to determine, and not a matter for the courts, although there are probably definitely avenues, I think, that still exist for sort of perhaps narrower or smaller cases in Canada. And again, this is just my lay understanding, kind of following it from a distance. However, on the issue of government support for fossil fuels in Canada, my sense is there may be some avenues for pursuing action on that and relief through the courts. And there are potentially some international mechanisms within Canada. It could also be interesting to look at whether Canada is breaching its international climate commitments through its international fossil fuel finance, for example. Although it hasn't been tested. So I think something that I'm certainly interested in, and I know there's some discussion about this being undertaken in the Canadian context, but it would be hard to know exactly where it would go. And one thing, while I'm on this issue, just a bit of a tangent to come back to my presentation, because Beert asked this question, I should also note that thanks in large part to the work that Beert and colleagues are doing in the Netherlands, that the government of the Netherlands has also committed to hosting a summit on aligning export credits with the Paris Agreement next year. A date to be determined. My understanding is it's kind of when it can be done in person, so when it's relatively safe to do so after the coronavirus pandemic abates. But just another note on the kind of international pressure that could be on Canada to actually step up on this issue. So yeah, many thanks for that, Beert.
Thanks, Alex. I see a comment from Joy about using the Just Recovery for All frame to address the post-COVID fossil fuel production risk of rebound. Joy, I think that's a great point. There was a UN report that came out just today that really warns that, if we're not getting our COVID recovery packages right, if they're not aligning with the climate crisis and equity issues, this is our last best chance to do exactly that. But on the issue of equity in terms of fossil fuel subsidy reform, Angela, do you want to speak more to that?
Yes, sure, Julia, thanks. I like the question also from Joy. I agree. I mean, the Just Recovery for All framework as a high level framework is great, and I think it's exactly what we need. What we've seen in our research on the fossil fuel subsidies and proposing routes for reform away from that is that in general, the question of just transition keeps on coming up, and rightly so. I think it's really the big question because, it's ultimately what is going to make whatever policy we decide to design feasible or not, practical or not. And that's why it's particularly important. I think there are a couple of points to that. So one is, we need to understand better what are the impacts of policies that we decide to implement on the different parts of the population. And I think on that, there has been good research, but maybe not enough. The other side is we need to understand what is perceived as fair or not, because this is also something not necessarily related to what is the direct impact of a policy. And yeah, I mean, I will be brief just to conclude, but we've seen, for example, for fossil fuel subsidies that there has been a bit of studies on who currently benefits from fossil fuel subsidies. And I think we need more of that in different geographical contexts. We need to understand that better. And we need to understand what happens, who pays the cost when you remove certain subsidies, because also that is not clear. That depends on the mechanism you use, depends on the revenue recycling you put in place, how you compensate, if you can call it, the losers. And it's, all of these are important questions, which I think could be answered when we start broadening up the concept of just transition. So I think just transition as it is perceived now, as it is intended now, as workers' right, it's super important, but it's probably not enough. We need to look at the distributional concerns of all these policies that we've been talking about and really understand the details of that better. And I'll stop there.
That was fantastic, Angela. Thank you for bringing that into today's conversation. And I think we have time for one last question. There's a question, maybe you could answer it, Alex, about whether Biden has explicitly ruled out oil and gas expansion in the Arctic and other so-called frontier areas, public lands offshore, and whether he can do that, whether he can prohibit this through executive action.
Yeah, there were some earlier commitments to ending sort of new oil and gas leases on public lands. I think it remains to be seen whether the Biden administration will actually take those steps. In terms of the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, that has been pretty concrete and clear in terms of the commitment, where the Biden administration intends to protect those lands. In terms of recourse there, the Trump administration is rushing to auction off leases in the Arctic before Biden's inaugurated in January. So the lease sale, I think, is set for sometime in early January before the inauguration. But given the procedural mess and the sort of failure of the Trump administration to comport with procedural norms and guidelines, my expectation is that the Biden administration itself could, even their Bureau of Land Management, for example, could sue to kind of reopen that process or revisit it. So a bit of an open question, but I think they have recourse on that one in particular, and other public lands. I think we'll have to just keep up the pressure to make sure that they take other public lands and offshore off the table in terms of expansion, and ultimately try to push for a managed decline of oil and gas production in federal lands and waters. Thanks.
Thanks for that, Alex. And now I'm going to turn to each of the panelists for just their closing thoughts, key takeaways, just a couple of minutes to close us off. And Michael, I'm going to start with you.
Yeah, thanks. And thanks everyone for joining us. I mean, we're at this exciting time right now. We're seeing south of the border a change of administrations and some new policy frameworks come in. We're seeing in Canada the most ambitious climate plan that you've had to date. And just to recall, it's called, I think, Healthy Environment and Healthy Economy. And to really do that, as folks have already said, we need to end these subsidies and avoid this lock-in of a fossil intensive development path and economy that makes the transition harder. The key to the just and equitable transition is to start that wind down now. And countries need to align, hold countries accountable, hold your administration accountable to aligning its energy plans and policies and support with its climate commitments. It's really comes down to that. And there's leadership happening right now around the world. We heard about UK export finance for oil and gas ending. We not mentioned yet today was Denmark a couple of weeks ago announcing that they were going to end all current and future licensing for oil and gas production in the North Sea. They are the second largest European oil and gas producer. There's momentum building for this. Seize it and hold your elected officials accountable to do so.
Thanks for those closing words and for bringing Denmark's exciting announcement into this conversation, Michael. Vanessa, you next.
Thanks. I mean, we've covered a lot of ground in this webinar, so there's a lot of information here. And if you think you know someone that might benefit from hearing these presentations, we are recording it, and the link will be posted shortly. So please share it with your friends and contacts and government contacts. My closing comments would be, you know, we have a government that is clearly committed and recommitted in their climate plan to phase out inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. But as the presentations from my colleagues on this call make it clear, we have a lot more to do than just that. We also have to tackle the vast amount of fossil fuel support that's happening, and we have to tackle the subsidies that are happening at the provincial level. So on public finance, that includes dealing with Export Development Canada and bringing them in line with the climate ambition we need to have as a government and as a country. And it includes putting money towards and actually implementing just transition. There was very little mention of just transition mechanisms in the climate plan. A lot of reference to workers, but less specifically on how we're going to actually support communities and workers that need to transition. So we're waiting to see when government's going to introduce its Just Transition Act, and if that will be accompanied by actual fiscal investments to help those communities. And lastly, this whole conversation fits within a larger conversation of whether or not Canada is ambitious enough. Yes, we have the most ambitious climate plan we've had ever, so that's something to celebrate. But if we look how Canada is comparing internationally, it's not ambitious enough. We have a range of a 32 to 40% target to reduce our emissions by 2030. 32% is only 2% higher than the 30% target we had before. And meanwhile, the EU is committed to 55% by 2030. So there's room to increase our ambition on all of these issues. And I encourage you and others to keep pushing government to increase ambition, because it will benefit not only our environment, but our economies and our communities.
Thanks, Vanessa. And I'll just add that a lot of Canada's environmental orgs, we did a fair share calculation of where Canada's 2030 target should be if we're aligned with the science and aligned to doing our fair share towards that 1.5 degree future. And it's a 60% reduction. So yeah, it is great that we do have a credible modeled plan to our current 2030 target, but that's half of where it needs to be. So there's a lot of room for increased ambition. Using my moderator privileges, jump in there. And Alex?
Thanks. Yeah, I would just say, you know, to sum it up, you know, with the Denmark announcement, just to add to what Michael said on that, you know, Denmark is ending their issuing new leases for oil and gas in the North Sea. They already had a prohibition against new leases for onshore. This, you know, the world is kind of coming for Canada on this, and you know, it might look like it's starting off in fits and starts, but this, you know, for people with a little bit of a longer memory, I mean, this is where the conversation on coal was, you know, maybe a decade ago, or a little less than a decade ago, and things are accelerating all the time in terms of the urgency around climate action. So I think this is, you know, things are really starting to move, and Canada's been hiding behind the Trump administration in many ways, in my view, for the last 4 years. That's about to change. And I think, you know, we have work to do in the US to pressure the Biden administration to step up. But I think that, you know, we have a lot more opportunity to engage other governments this way from the U.S. perspective. And my hope is that, yeah, instead of being dragged along, that Canada realizes what's around the corner and starts to step up. You know, the Danish commitment involves not only the end to the oil and gas licenses, but also significant, potentially significant investments in supporting communities and workers in a just transition. And that's the other thing I think that Canada has to get really serious about. You know, there's been a lot of good discussion and thinking around this, and some implementation already on the coal side in Canada, which is obviously a much smaller segment of the Canadian economy and affects far fewer workers and communities, but a lot of learning that can be applied. And so, as Michael also said, you know, I think that the sooner we start, the easier it'll be, or the less difficult it will be. There's the only other option is an unmanaged decline of fossil fuel production, and that's not going to be good for workers, communities, the climate, or the economy. So I think we need to get serious about that, and Canada needs to start acting now. But I appreciate everybody participating in this conversation.
Thanks for those words, Alex. And lastly, over to you, Angela.
Thank you, Julia. I think, I mean, what our research, not only ours, all the research that has been presented has shown is that probably, you know, we need to focus the efforts to phase out support to fossil fuels, especially when it comes to oil and gas, because this is the big chunk that is still there. We need to, and this has been mentioned already, have public finance institutions to implement exclusion policy, explicit exclusion policies for support to oil, gas, and coal projects. And we need to have probably a bigger role for SOEs in the transition, because as we've seen also, they have a big part in the support, in the total support to fossil fuels. So we personally, I mean, I don't believe that SOEs need to sell out their shares and privatize. Probably that's one way, but not the way that we would prefer. We think that SOEs need to really diversify their investments away from fossil fuels, and we've seen some of that happening already in, you know, in Denmark, in Sweden, in India recently. So that's possible. And just looking at the package, the recovery package that have been implemented over the last year, they also can be greened. I mean, a lot of money has been mobilized in a very short amount of time. And what has been the, you know, first rushed response can be followed by a more sophisticated response, where this package can probably have more space for example, environmental and social conditionality, which is very much needed. So I think there is a lot of hope there. And yeah, thanks for organizing this event. It was really great.
Thank you, Angela. And I'd like to thank all of our panelists and the organizations that put together this webinar, especially the International Institute for Sustainable Development for convening this conversation. It was a really timely and important conversation. And I'd like to extend a huge thank you to all of our participants for tuning in, spending an hour and a half with us as we dig into these important issues, and asking some really great questions. The recorded version will be out soon, so please do share it. And join in on the conversation on social media using the hashtag #StopFundingFossils. Stay safe and happy holidays.
Thanks, everyone.